session from the Secretary of State, George Eustace, Secretary of State for Defra. What we're trying to do today is to understand the progress towards an EU-UK agreement, particularly obviously on the Defra environment side. And can I just quickly just go through some housekeeping? First of all, this is a live webcast, and there is evidence being taken, and that will be circulated to our witnesses. And if there are any mistakes in it, please let us know. Can I ask members to declare their interests the first time that they speak, if they have any? And can I just record that I'm a co-chair of Cornwall and Isles of Scilly Local Nature Partnership. Perhaps Secretary of State, welcome. It's very good to have you with us. And perhaps I could just, first of all, I think everybody knows you well, but perhaps I could just ask if your two officials could just introduce themselves briefly as well. And then if that's okay, we'll move straight into questions. Emma, do you want to start us off, just to introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name's Emma Bourne, and I'm the Director of Constitution and Borders in Defra, so I'm responsible for some of our domestic preparations for the end of the transition period.
Thank you. And Mark? Are you there? Okay. I can't hear Mark Thompson, but we'll start anyway. Secretary of State, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, and I'll perhaps ask the office to, I think if someone's listening in on this, to just see if we can locate Mark.
Yeah, of course. Yes, he's there. Mark, would you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, sorry, I lost connection for a second. Hi everyone, Mark Thompson here. I am Deputy Director of our EU Strategy and Negotiations team. So I'm responsible for overseeing all of our negotiations with the EU.
Okay, thank you. You're all welcome. Perhaps I could just start off then. Secretary of State, Defra, as Secretary of State of Defra, you have very, very wide responsibilities: adaptation in terms of climate change, environment, food, agriculture, fish, chemicals, biosecurity, rural development. I mean, it's a very big portfolio. And so I suppose my first question is what your priorities are for Defra in this future relationship in negotiations with the EU. And as part of that, I think we'd be interested to understand, given the importance of many of these areas in the negotiation, how do you keep in touch with Sir David Frost and the negotiating team? Do you participate in it, or do they keep very close to you, or do they just go off by themselves and hope you're happy at the end of the day?
Okay, well, I'll come to that point after. But I think the first thing to note is, as members of the committee will know, in recent decades, probably around 80% of all of the regulations affecting Defra have been EU derived. And so this for Defra is a very big change, because we've largely been, in the business of putting into place and implementing either EU directives or EU regulations. And I think, coming to your initial point, what are our priorities? It really is to, take back control of these policy areas and start designing new policies that work for the UK, and to have that freedom to innovate in the space of policy. And that's what, the three flagship bills that we've got going through are all about. In particular, the, agriculture bill that will, chart a new course for agriculture policy, move away from the arbitrary area-based subsidy payments of the EU regime to something around payment for public goods. In fisheries, taking back control of our exclusive economic zone again, and managing the fisheries resources in that space in a way that's good for our marine resources, and controlling access to our waters, and in the environment as well. Looking at how we can really deliver for our environment in a more effective way. So our priority really is to be able to regain control in these areas that have been set by EU policy for some time. Obviously, within that, in terms of the FTA, we are seeking, zero tariffs on all goods, so tariff-free access for our sectors into the EU, and in return, reciprocating and granting them tariff-free access for their agri-foods into the UK market. We are also seeking a partnership agreement on fisheries that we think should be modelled on the EU-Norway partnership agreement. In fisheries, we want to be like Norway. And on your final point, just briefly, I do work closely with David Frost. We have members of our team, particularly on fisheries, who are very much plugged into the negotiation and helping to inform the approach that we take on that. I met David Frost just this week to discuss the current negotiations that he's engaged in. Obviously, there's an intensive phase now during July. So we are very closely engaged. He very much seeks our view and the policy expertise that we have in Defra to inform the approach.
Are you overall optimistic that some sort of deal will be done? It seems very much on a knife edge at the moment, given the length of time we have to sort this out to, as the Prime Minister, I think himself has said, to make sure we give business of whatever kind sufficient notice of what in terms of our final removal will be.
Well, I think I am optimistic in that you have to be, optimistic in this area, and the European Union, has a habit in negotiations such as this, as going to the wire before they will conclude an agreement. But I think also it's important to acknowledge that in the first phase of the negotiations up until June, it's no secret, and David Frost himself has explained this. There's been quite a difference in the two positions because, in two particular areas, the European Union was showing a lack of flexibility on level playing field provisions, where they wanted to have us bound by effectively EU regulations, for the long term, and also in fisheries where they've been slow, I think, to recognise the reality of international law, which is when we leave, we do become an independent coastal state, and that will take effect from the end of the transition period. So there's been some sticking points, and there's been a lack of willingness on the EU to date to sort of revise their mandate to take account of what we're asking for. And that's what we need to try and unblock in the next month. And I think what I would say is, we're not really asking for anything unrealistic. We've sought always to seek precedent where it exists, and so much of what we're asking for is modelled on a sort of EU-Canada free trade agreement. We're not looking for anything in a way that's special or bespoke. We're looking for something that is a sensible free trade agreement. We recognise that there would be consequences of that. There would be some border checks. There would be a need for export health certificates and catch certificates and so on. We recognise that that's the reality of the stance that we've taken, but we're happy to accept that because ultimately, if we're leaving the European Union, you want to have the benefits of being able to set your own policies in many of these areas, and that's quite important to us and one of our priorities.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Secretary. I think probably I asked Michelle, sorry, I got you.
Michelle Barnier.
You negotiator, about fisheries. We'll come on to that later on. He was certainly showed his signs of being flexible, so let's hope that's the case. I'm going to bring in Baroness McIntosh, please.
Thank you, Lord Chair, and good morning and welcome to the Secretary of State and his team. Can I ask one question in three parts? First of all, every department has been impacted by COVID-19, and obviously during the course of the last 3 months, you'll have lost through self-isolation a number of staff. Has that had a big impact on the back of the work you've done on retained EU legislation? Have you been running at full power over the last 3 months?
I think it's had impact in some areas, but not so much in others. And I think the first thing to note is, obviously we've had several runs at a potential so-called no-deal Brexit over the last 12 months. And, on each of those, I think we were sort of marched up the hill 3 times in total. There was a great deal of planning that went in to how we could make that work. And therefore the level of understanding that we have in terms of everything around export health certificates, the capacity that you'd need to do that, catch certificates, all of those sorts of areas, and even the legislation. You will recall we had a huge amount of SIs that went through in the last Parliament to make retained EU law operable. That's largely there in place and will be operable. The bit that remains is, there are some further SIs. Defra's got, I think between 20 and 30 SIs that we will need to be putting in place, over the next 6 months or so. And some of those relate to putting in place measures that will make it easier for us to get an agreement with the EU. So alignment on things such as organics regulations and so forth. Some of them are about making sure we're in a position to start, for instance, the agricultural transition from January next year. So powers under the agriculture bill in order to be able to start making the changes we want to make. So on the legislative side, while there is still more work to do, I think we've identified what needs to be done, and that's on course. The bit, though, that I think it's fair to say has been impacted by the coronavirus is our preparations for border controls for EU goods coming in, and putting in place the border inspection posts, or border control posts as they're now called, recruiting the staff to do all of that work. That was impacted by the coronavirus episode. We know that in order to have full reciprocal checks, we would have needed to be progressing that and developing the infrastructure and doing the development orders and so forth, probably from around March and April. And that obviously was affected by coronavirus. So to address that particular area, you will have seen that Michael Gove announced some weeks ago now our intention to have a phased approach to introducing border control posts, with a view that we would start with light touch administrative checks, principally on things that already require them, extending that to other products of animal origin, and with physical checks starting from July next year.
Thank you. I think we come on to that, but I'll merge my next two questions just for time, if I may. In 2018, the previous committee concluded that the government preparations were not progressing quickly enough. Secretary of State, you said that it's all about regaining control, but as far as businesses are expressing to us, they're worried about losing control. So can I ask what progress is being made on developing a UK REACH agreement, putting in place everything that we need to do? Are you confident that UK chemical manufacturers will continue to be able to sell their products within the EU to the EU next year, and that the high environmental standards that we've achieved will be maintained for those products coming from the EU to here? And as you'll be aware, there is real concern about the availability of safety information. And in the briefings that I've seen, it could literally run into millions of pounds. So what are the cost implications of running two separate regimes? What oversight will there be of the decision-making process? And what resources are going to be made available to Health and Safety England to run the UK regime? We just simply don't have that information.
Well, we have, so UK REACH, was established, and the software was in place, ready to go, had there been a no deal in the last Parliament. So that is still there. Our approach will be to effectively launch UK REACH from day one. We will give, in the first instance, 120 days grace period to enable companies to lodge their products on UK REACH, the ones they already have on the residual EU REACH system. Give them time to do that with the initial data, and bear in mind, this has already been assessed with full data packages on the EU system. So there's a sort of grandfathering system, if you like, to bring across those existing ones. We then give them, a further period in order to supply the full data set, which I think we've currently set at around 2 years. And we think that this is a proportionate approach because it enables us to basically authorize those chemicals that are already approved in the EU to be sold in the UK with an initial data set and with a full data set to follow thereafter. Now, the issue of cost is it's a difficult one for reasons that I'll explain. One of the things, if we get a free trade agreement that we will be seeking, is a data sharing agreement with the EU, so that on those grandfathered chemical products that are currently on EU REACH and soon to be on UK REACH, there's an ability to share the data that underpins that, which I think will be in everybody's interest, including the EU. And in terms of British chemical companies that currently have EU REACH authorizations, we don't think they'll have a particular problem in terms of selling into the EU, because most of them will either have an arrangement with an agent or a wholesaler, or indeed will have their own subsidiaries somewhere within the EU, and that enables them to effectively continue to operate within the EU REACH scheme. So that if we can't get any data sharing arrangements and no agreement on that is possible, well, then there could start to be obviously costs of those companies marshalling the data that they currently have on EU REACH and lodging it with the UK system. That'll be easier for the larger companies, the Bayers and the Johnson Mattheys and companies like that, because they've got access to that data. It could be a particular issue with some of the downstream companies that currently don't hold those registrations but may need to if they're an importer. So there could be some issues, but we hope that we'll be able to solve that through the free trade agreement with some data sharing provisions.
Which is great, but you still can't get around the problem. They're going to be operating 2 separate REACH systems, whereas currently they're only operating one. And I know the government from the outset said they weren't seeking to become an associate member of either the UK Chemicals Agency or participate in REACH itself. But would that not have been wiser from the point of view of allowing companies to carry on as seamlessly as possible?
Well, we looked at it, but we thought in the end that was probably too complicated to make work, and the danger that it would, cross one of our important red lines, which is not, going under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice on these matters. So that's why we took the decision to, establish a standalone UK REACH system, but then to seek a data sharing agreement, which we thought made more sense. I mean, there is precedent for a similar approach. Switzerland, for instance, has its own system, and there's an overlap with the EU system. It'll often recognise things that are on the EU system, but it does have its own standalone, register of chemicals nonetheless.
Okay, I think we need to move on, but I know that, as you're aware, Secretary, the chemical industry is still very concerned about getting ahead on these arrangements. If I could bring in now Lord Goldsmith, who's chair of our International Agreements Subcommittee. Lord Goldsmith.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Secretary of State, good morning, and thank you very much indeed. I've been invited, and I'm very grateful, by the chairman of this subcommittee, as he's just said, as the chairman of our International Agreements Committee. So I'm more focusing on agreements outside the EU than the agreement with the EU. And of course, one of those areas that we're looking at already are the negotiations with US, Japan, Australia and New Zealand. And Agrifood is plainly a very, very important theme for all of those negotiations. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, how are you and your department keeping up with those talks, and particularly helping the negotiators on those talks to balance the different interests which are involved, both, as it were, defensive interests for the UK and offensive interests for the UK?
Yes, it's a very good point. And the answer is that we are engaged deeply at every level in those discussions. So I have regular discussions with Liz Truss on our approach to those negotiations and discussing the mandate that we adopt on those particular negotiations. you'll be familiar, as I know many members on the committee are former government and cabinet ministers. So on all of these issues, there's a full government right round process, which means the Defra is at both the ministerial and Secretary of State level very plugged into what is agreed and what is discussed. Separate to that, we have officials from Defra who are experts in agri-food trade and experts in SPS issues that are embedded on the UK negotiating teams. So there are key officials from Defra in our trade teams who have a deep understanding. Agriculture is always a complicated area, and have a deep understanding both of how agricultural tariffs work and tariff rate quota works, and doing some of the modelling on those sorts of areas. But also, through our veterinary side, through the chief vet and her office, some of the SPS issues as well, since we would be, largely responsible for overseeing the SPS chapter in all of those agreements.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask one supplemental? And I appreciate this is a wide topic, and I thank you for the answer, that it's a government interest, not solely a Defra interest. But are you able to say, just to help us, from the point of view of defensive interests, which is really, from Defra's point of view, interests for UK agriculture and so forth, are the key issues, key priorities that you have?
Well, in terms of our defensive interests, I think it varies from agreement to agreement. So you mentioned a number. If I start with Japan, Japan exports a small amount. I think it's very small, no more than about 50 tons a year of, Wagyu beef under an existing EU agreement. And I think it's fair to say that because Japan is quite keen to conclude an early agreement, it's likely that agreement will be akin to a sort of continuity agreement, rather like many of the others that we concluded last year. And we don't really have many defensive interests or concerns in respect of our agreement with Japan. But we also do have lots of opportunities for, market access, particularly on, beef and lamb and potentially pork as well. So if you look at the other end of the scale, obviously with the United States, it's quite different because, they are a large agricultural net exporter. And we suspect will be seeking, also haven't got to that level of discussion yet, but probably will be seeking access for agricultural produce. For a lot of their products, we're not a producer, or we already compete internationally. So on most crops, for instance, we think it's possible to have a discussion in those areas. But then there will be sensitive sectors. And in the case of the US, also sensitive sectors that are partly sensitive because of a differential in approach to livestock husbandry, in particular animal welfare standards. And so, we will need to address our approach on those sensitive sectors to make sure that, we're not effectively undercutting our own domestic producers with products using systems that would be, literally illegal in the UK. So we're looking closely at how we can have an approach that recognises those sensitive sectors. And then finally, I think you mentioned New Zealand and Australia. Challenge there is probably slightly different again, in that New Zealand and Australia adopted a similar kind of culture to the UK in terms of its animal welfare legislation. We were the first country in the world, the late Victorian era and early 1900s to bring forward on-farm animal welfare legislation, and Australia and New Zealand broadly copied that and therefore have a culture that's quite similar. So the differences...
I think probably we need to move on pretty quickly. Just conclude on that fairly quickly, and then when you need to...
I'll conclude very quickly, but on Australia and New Zealand, the differences in, for instance, animal welfare are probably not as great as they are with the US, but also, we'll still have some defensive interests that we need to be mindful of, particularly on the sheep sector.
I'm very grateful, and I'm sorry I'm outstaying my welcome. So thank you very much, Secretary of State.
Not at all. No. But I would ask if we could keep questions and answers relatively short, so we can get through the agenda. And we move on to the rather contentious area of fisheries, and first of all, Earl of Stair.
Good morning. Minister, yes, the fisheries and the government's current plans to model future negotiations, annual negotiations, on a similar arrangement to the Norwegians. The Norwegians are basing their negotiations with their agreements with the EU on 5 different fish stocks. We have got considerably more. Have you assessed what UK resources will be needed for an annual negotiation of quota allocations on all the fish stocks that we share between the United Kingdom and the EU, both in terms of staff and time?
Yes, I think the picture here is quite positive, because we have within Defra CFAS, which is our Fisheries Science Agency, which is probably the leading fisheries science agency in the world. And Carl O'Brien, our chief fisheries scientist, is indeed the deputy president of ICES, which does all of the data on these matters. And it's always been the case that UK officials, principally through CFAS, but also our officials within the MMO and Defra, have a lot of expertise in this area and largely inform the approach that the European Union has already taken to other negotiations. And indeed at December Council, it's usually the UK that picks up errors in calculation, for instance, on biomass on a particular stock. So we've got a powerful resource in CFAS, which gives us a good understanding of how we should approach individual stocks. They've already done quite a lot of detailed work, for instance, on zonal attachment. So I think we start in a very good place, but I know they're also looking at whether we would need to, build some capacity around the negotiation teams as well, and that's something that's being considered. But it's not a standing start, because we've always done a large amount of work to inform the EU position anyway.
But that's very useful, having a basis there to start working on. But I mean, if we are negotiating with a considerable higher number of stocks, I mean, there will be more time, there will be more staff needed. Have you got any plans in place to increase the staff and the time allocation?
Yes, as I said, I think the teams are looking at whether we need to build capacity, and I think we will be bringing on additional staff to bolster those teams. But I don't think it'll need to be, a significant change. And in fact, there's a big premium on having people who are experienced, who've been doing this anyway within Defra over the last decade or so, since they really understand how these negotiations work. And as always, the difficulty of bringing in new people who don't have that experience or that hinterland is that, sometimes what they can add is less than you might hope.
Yeah. And what are the financial implications, and who will pay?
Well, if we were to expand CFAS or indeed our internal team, then that would be, a Defra-funded, Defra-funded endeavour. We're obviously, we've already had significant additional funds from the Treasury to deal with Brexit and to prepare for that. And I suspect in a post-EU world, some of those would be continued. There'd be an appraisal of what additional support would be needed in areas like this.
So there'd be no further financial implications for the fishing industry?
No, the negotiation team is very much something that is funded, by the Exchequer.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to continue with the fisheries and getting to the heart of the issue. And Lord Giddens.
Thanks so much for your fluent answer so far. I come back to it, as was said, the thorny issue of fisheries. Where do you see the potential landing zone for a fisheries agreement? What compromises do you think might be possible? Monsieur Barnier has arrived in London talking of possible creative solutions. Apparently had halibut for dinner in Downing Street last night, apparently. Maybe that's a good sign. Can you say how far the gap is getting closer to being closed between the two sides?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the gap, remains, quite wide at the moment. But our sense is that there might be a slight sort of change from the EU, and that I think within the Commission and DG Mari in particular, there's obviously quite a lucid understanding, if I can put it that way, of international law in this space, to conduct international fisheries negotiations with Norway and Faroes and others. And I think they understand what it means to be an independent coastal state and what that means in international law. So I think they're starting to understand that the starting point isn't the common fisheries policy and what might we like to have a little bit better from that. The starting point is that we're an independent coastal state. Now that's an important starting point, but we're still some way from, I think, being able to discuss what a landing zone might be. Our view is that a sensible landing zone really is something where there's precedent, and we think the sort of EU-Norway partnership model is a sensible starting point, in that it commits to have annual negotiations and commits to annual discussions on access and sharing arrangements. Over time, it kind of settles into a relatively stable approach, because you get to a sense of reasonably stable but fair shares, and then things can move forward from that. But the principle of annual negotiations to discuss these matters with our neighbours is the starting point, and that's what we've got to get to first.
But hasn't the EU been fairly dismissive of the Norway model for the UK so far? Do you think that gap can be closed?
Well, I think it can be closed, because obviously if there's no, if there isn't a fisheries agreement, then the default is what's set out in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the UK would become an independent coastal state by default. So that's the legal baseline, if you like, rather than the CFP. I think it's understandable in some ways that we as the UK only catch about half of the fish in our own waters. The other half is effectively given as an allocation to other parts of the EU fleet, in particular from France and Belgium and Ireland and Denmark. And so it's understandable in some ways that they'd be apprehensive about a departure from the arrangements that they've got. But I think set against that, they also understand international law in these areas and the importance of abiding by it.
Okay, thanks so much.
Just a comment, I think they also understand a lot of politics, where, like in our own country, the fishing communities feel very strongly about it, and obviously the politicians representing them as well, which I think is part of the difficulty here. But we're going to move on then on the similar subject to Lord Cameron.
Yes, thank you very much, Secretary of State. Just carrying on with that whole question of the Norway agreement and the annual allocations, I was wondering if we could sort of find a landing ground, if you were prepared, if you could get the principle of zonal attachment in there, would you be prepared to agree to a multi-annual plan, which would give some sort of reliability to the industry on both sides of the channel, and also might undermine some of the suspicions the Europeans have about this annual allocation of quota?
Yeah, I think we're not really at this stage to be able to do that at the moment. Our view is that the starting point is to get text agreed on that partnership agreement, which, as I said, we've published a text. It's modelled on the Norway approach, and under the Norway approach, issues such as access and shares are discussed annually. It is the case that over time, the sharing arrangements and access arrangements develop a kind of inherent stability, but it's not necessarily fixed in an agreement. And I think the other thing is, sometimes on an individual stock, it's not uncommon for there to be a multi-annual agreement, but not necessarily on all stocks. So there is, for instance, a multi-annual agreement on mackerel at the moment that covers the Faroes and the EU and Norway. There's a sharing agreement on that at coastal states that runs for several years. So it can happen on individual stocks, but we're really not at the position to be able to to even get to that point yet. The key thing is to get that text agreed first, which is effectively the partnership agreement, which sets out the rules of engagement in those annual negotiations.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Just two further questions. I mean, one is, when's the latest date you think you might be able to settle with the EU in order to establish 2021 tax? And also, we've got very valuable fishery exports to Europe. What sort of preparations has Defra made for the possibility that games will be played either on tariffs or even perhaps even worse, wildcat strikes at French ports or Spanish ports in terms of our exports?
Yes, so on your first point, obviously the original withdrawal agreement envisaged that we would have a fisheries partnership agreement in July. I think the genesis of that was it was largely aligned with the opportunity to extend the transition period. I think that was the thinking from the EU side in putting that particular date in. So it has less relevance now than it once did, because we were always clear we wouldn't extend the transition period. So I think it doesn't matter if we can put together a partnership agreement, even if it's a little bit later this year, that would be fine. To answer though, in the final analysis, obviously annual negotiations occur every year during the months of November, and in the case of the EU December Council, right up to the middle of December. So it could be left as late as December in order to get a final agreement on tax and quota shares and access for 2021. And that's not at all unusual in fisheries negotiations. Indeed, the EU-Norway negotiation sometimes goes into extra time and occasionally isn't concluded until the end of January. And during that month of January, access arrangements get suspended while negotiations continue. So we could go really quite late in terms of getting that final agreement.
And what about the possible Defra preparations for maintaining trade our exports?
Yes. So look, if there's no free trade agreement, then obviously, there's a high probability that the European Union would then put tariffs, MFN tariffs, on our fisheries exports. We'd looked at this quite closely, and although tariffs on exports are obviously always going to be unwelcome, it's important to note that on the key species that we export, the tariffs are reasonably low. So farmed salmon from Scotland is a really big export, and the tariff there is only about 2 or 3%. And on shellfish, it's an average of around 7 or 8%, I think. So we obviously wouldn't want those tariffs if they could be avoided, but they would be, manageable. And certainly the message from the industry generally is, don't sell out the catching sector on our behalf, in that they can cope with tariffs, but the fishing industry really wants us to regain control of our EEZ and get a fairer settlement of those fisheries resources for our fishermen.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's move on to a broader area of agri-food and Lord Carter.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Good morning, Secretary of State. Thank you for your time. This committee has sensed considerable anxiety from the Northern Ireland agri-food sector, particularly around the checks and controls required on goods moving from GB to Northern Ireland. Could you tell us which parts of the UK-EU relationship the government is prioritising to reduce these checks?
Well, there will be there's a joint committee process to work through the very precise granular detail of the Northern Ireland Protocol and how that would work. And I think just stepping back from this, when I was engaged in some of the no deal preparations in the last Parliament, some of the most difficult, intractable problems we had were around agri-food trade going from Northern Ireland to the Irish Republic. And so I think from memory, it's around 35% of all milk production in Northern Ireland goes south. And working out how we could do export health certificates, cope with customs arrangements and so forth to enable that trade to continue was one of the big difficulties that we had. And so the Northern Ireland and Irish border has been a difficult issue to try to resolve throughout this process. And I think in the end, the judgment call we made is that it would be better through the Northern Ireland Protocol to have some limited arrangements at points of entry in Northern Ireland to manage this situation, so that you wouldn't have all of the consequential difficulties on the Irish border. Now, obviously, that does create some challenges, but we've been working very, very closely with Defra on this to identify what would be needed under the protocol. And we'll be having continued discussions with the EU on precisely the scope and extent of the checks that will be required in some of those key ports of entry.
But how confident are you in the time that's ahead of us that you'll be able to get these effective checks and controls in that don't actually retard the movement of goods?
I'm reasonably confident on that. Obviously, time is tight, as always with these things, but there is clarity in the Northern Ireland Protocol about the types of SPS checks that are required. There are, certain things that we will be discussing with through the joint committee process. So, one of the most difficult thing perhaps is around composite loads from supermarkets taking a lorry with multiple products to an individual store in Northern Ireland. So we'll be trying to work out whether there can be special provisions on that. Otherwise, it'll cause quite an issue. And we know that those goods, for instance, aren't at risk of entering the EU market because they're going by definition to directly to stores in Northern Ireland. So we think that we can resolve these difficulties. We've already lodged some initial applications and proposals with the European Commission, and that dialogue is ongoing, and we're working closely with Defra. So yes, there are challenges. It's a challenging timescale, but we do think we can deliver it.
Thank you.
I would say, Secretary of State, and you'll be aware we've sent you a letter about Northern Ireland. I mean, the industry out there is actually pretty desperate to know practically what they need to do. And we had a joint meeting with our equivalent committee of the Northern Ireland Assembly. I mean, the great news on that was you had the DUP, Sinn Féin, UUP, Alliance Party and the Greens all completely united with one voice, which I've never heard from Northern Ireland before, but they were all desperate to understand the details of what they had to do in terms of even providing infrastructure and the timescale that they were very, very concerned about. But I'll leave that as a comment and ask Duke of Montrose to come in finally on this particular aspect.
Thank you, Lord Chairman, and thank you, Secretary of State. I declare an interest as a former livestock farmer whose family is continuing with that. As the Chairman was telling us, the briefing that we had unearthed worries about the EU asking for export certificates for anything from the Northern Ireland to the UK. But my main question is, what would be the challenges for the government in delivering the protocol arrangements in the absence of a UK-EU trade agreement?
I think the crucial thing about the withdrawal agreement and the current approach on the Northern Ireland Protocol is that whether or not we have a free trade agreement with the EU, there is at least now clarity about the approach that we would be taking around the Northern Ireland and Ireland border, and it means that those farm businesses and food businesses that currently often send their product to the Irish Republic and then bring it back up to Northern Ireland, they've got clarity about how arrangements will work, and there won't be checks at the Ireland border. So I think there's also clarity in the protocol about what types of checks under the protocol we would need to put in place at the point, if you like, of entry into Northern Ireland from GB. And the other key thing is that the Prime Minister stressed all along that in terms of trade from Northern Ireland to GB, we will be giving unfettered access, and there'll be a very small number of areas, for instance, where there's an international convention like CITES that has particular requirements that are difficult to get around. There may need to be some modest checks in those areas, but otherwise it will be unfettered access to the GB market for goods coming from Northern Ireland.
Baroness Jolly. I can't hear you at the moment.
Apologies.
I'm
not sure when you last met with Northern Ireland agribusiness, but they spoke to us, and there are serious concerns regarding regulatory divergence between Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the relevant common frameworks. How are you responding?
Well, there will be. We don't think this is. We're dealing with this through unfettered access, and there will obviously be, issues and approaches and frameworks we'll need to put in place in the context of the UK internal market, and we're working with the devolved administrations on that area. But we don't see the fact that that England or other parts of the UK may over time diverge from the European Union, but in some areas Northern Ireland won't, as necessarily being a major problem on the UK internal market, and that's why we're confident we can guarantee that unfettered access.
Okay, thank you.
But I may ask here, I don't know whether Emma, I'm conscious neither of my officials of whether Emma Bourne, who's obviously been doing some work on this, would like to add something.
Yeah, Emma.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I think probably the only point I would add is that we are engaging with those businesses that you describe in those sectors very closely, and working very closely with colleagues in the Northern Ireland office who have quite a deep set of business engagement arrangements in place. So part of what we're doing here is listening to that feedback and thinking about how we implement the unfettered market access approaches that the Secretary of State described in that context. And we've sort of set out the sort of guiding principles for how we would do that in the recently published command paper as well. So sort of recognising the issues, but listening very closely to their feedback to ensure that we are reflecting that in the operational approach on the ground, and also being really clear with them and getting the kind of information flows out there as much as possible. I think clarity of information is critical to this as much as the operational arrangements on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. Actually, the command paper was welcomed very much by our Northern Ireland witnesses, but they were desperate for the detail beneath that. Baroness Bryan.
Yes, good morning. Yes, the witnesses that did speak to the committee and the written submissions were very concerned and far less comfortable that it would be resolved easily. Their concerns are obviously the additional checks and controls that might be required when we begin to do deals with the rest of the world that permits produce of different standards to enter Great Britain, and the presence of those goods would begin to impact on the ability to compete. So when proposing new agri-food standards, will you assess the impact of divergence between Great Britain and Northern Ireland on the need for checks and controls between the two markets and the ability of Northern Ireland companies to compete in the Great Britain market? Just to follow up something you said about divergence, it is possible that the devolved administrations could actually enhance their standards to the rest of the UK, but also the EU, and what impact might that have? Thank you.
Well, I think what I'd say is in terms of our considerations around all future free trade agreements, with the rest of the world, whether that's US or Australia or New Zealand, a big part of the test that we'll be applying is how does this affect, individual parts of the UK? And so, in Wales, obviously there's a large sheep industry. It's a significant beef industry in Scotland, and Northern Ireland has a very large poultry sector. So we will be taking all of that into account in the trade agreements that we do. And we've also been very clear that in all those trade agreements, we will decide our own SPS standards. And so I suspect, although I understand the anxiety, I suspect it will be misplaced, in that although there will be some divergence in regulation obviously over time in some areas, I don't think it will be sufficient to cause major competitive issues vis-a-vis Ireland coming into the GB market.
Secretary of State, I think it's just worth saying that we're not taking just pessimistic evidence here in the past. I mean, one of the things that I think the Northern Ireland industry see as a great opportunity is the fact they've got one foot in the single market at the same time they've got a foot in the UK single market, and they just want the ability to be able to make the best of those rather than lose out on both, which I suspect at the moment there is a concern about. But I guess we would ask you as a committee to keep your government colleagues who are negotiating these things feet to the fire to actually get these things resolved in Northern Ireland and the protocol as soon as possible. But we'll move on, and I have Lord Cormac. I can't hear you at the moment, Patrick.
Can you hear me now?
Indeed.
Yes.
Sorry about that. As a former chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, Secretary of State, I would just like to emphasise the importance of the points made by my colleagues and by the chairman. I really do fear for the future of the United Kingdom as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, unless we can get a suitable deal by the end of the year. And there is real unanimity of concern, which I have never seen before, across all parties in Northern Ireland. And I just ask you to take that on board when you're discussing this with your colleagues.
Okay, I very much will. I mean, I know, Lord Cormac, you've got lots of experience on this and understand all of the complexities in Northern Ireland far better than I personally do. But I can say that we are absolutely alive to the challenges of the protocol, and working out how to approach trade on both the island of Ireland and that Irish border, and squaring the circle with the importance of the integrity of the UK. Has obviously been, one of the great intractable problems as we chart this course out of the European Union. So, to square the circle, there have had to be certain compromises. We think we've made the right ones to make this work as effectively as possible. But we're absolutely applying ourselves to getting the detail right through that joint committee process.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I wish you success, of course. Moving on to the environment. What alternatives are you considering to the initial environment non-regression proposals? And would you yourself accept a reference to agreed common standards and recourse to sanctions for a small set of environment and climate policy areas which can impact on trade?
Well, this is obviously an area that David Frost, our negotiator, will be leading on. We've generally taken the view that on so-called level playing field requirements, we wouldn't go further than some of the sort of standard approaches in other FTAs like Canada. And I think the other important thing from my point of view is, as we come out of the European Union, it's important that we start to have our own ambitions and don't simply, cling on to what the EU's doing, but through the powers in the Environment Bill, set those new ambitious environmental targets that we've got, set out the new governance infrastructure through the OEP to ensure that we maintain progress, and actually crucially create the space for policy innovation so that we might be able to deploy environmental policies that achieve more for the recovery of habitats and species than some of the approaches in the past have. So, we've no intention of regressing, if you mean by that we would be, abandoning certain protections that we have in place now. But what we want to ensure we have is the freedom to pursue innovative policy that might do better, and not to be so restrictively bound to an EU approach that actually we can't innovate and deliver for the future.
Well, that's good to hear, but can you give the committee an absolute assurance that there will be no reneging on standards which we have publicly proclaimed are truly crucial?
Yes, and that's what the Environment Bill is all about. It's setting out lots of different targets in all of the key environmental areas, and we're setting up a governance framework, as I said. So, and it's also got lots of other things around extended producer responsibility and biodiversity net gain in the planning system. So there's a lot in the bill that actually takes us further beyond the types of protections that came through things like the Habitats and Birds Directives.
I think it's a bill that you will find will get very, very careful scrutiny in the House of Lords. And I hope you're ready for that. And I hope you will be willing to listen to what the many environmental experts, I'm not talking about myself, in the House of Lords will say during the bill, because this is a bill that will need careful scrutiny and some degree of amendment. And I hope it won't lead to any clash between the two houses.
I'm sure that your lordships always provide detailed scrutiny of every bill, and of course, the Environment Bill is a very large bill with lots in there. So I fully expect it to get thorough treatment and scrutiny in the Lords.
Thank you very much.
Good, and we're enjoying the agricultural bill at the moment as well.
We are indeed, aren't we? Yes.
A large number of the members here are involved in the 350 odd amendments. We're going to, just to comment out, it does seem to me in this area, Secretary of State, that in terms of whether it's climate change, environment, both sides, UK and EU, absolutely have the same aspirations here. And it seems that somewhat of an irony to me that somehow we seem to have got into a technical area that's one of the major divisions between us, when the aspiration of both sides seems to me to be very clear. And of course, we've worked very closely together in the past. But I'm going to move on to Baroness Brown, who's going to ask about level playing fields as well. Baroness Brown.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. And first, I need to declare an interest as Vice Chair of the Committee on Climate Change and Chair of the Adaptation Committee of the Committee on Climate Change. Secretary of State, you said in your opening remarks that zero tariff access was one of your top priorities. And we've been hearing from comments from Mr. Frost and Mr. Gove about potential compromises on environment and climate level playing field. One of those being potentially some use of tariffs as an alternative. So I'm interested to know if you're actively trying to persuade the EU that an agreement that includes some tariffs is an alternative to the proposed environment and climate level playing field provisions.
I may ask Mark to come in on this. I know he's dealing with some of the aspects of the trade deals, but I think what I would say, generally is, our position is that we're seeking 0-0 on all goods. We think, not least since we're a significant net importer, particularly on agri-food, that's in the interest of the EU as well. As a country, we're outward facing and quite liberal, so we think a 0-0 tariffs approach makes sense. But also, if it turns out that the sticking points and the differences around things like level playing field provisions mean that the European Union, isn't willing to entertain 0-0 on all goods, well then, if that is the case, then obviously we would be open, to a discussion where you'd have tariff liberalisation on those goods where we're able to achieve it. And it may be that some tariffs remained in place on some goods. It may be that in some of those areas on agriculture and fisheries, you might agree a sort of tariff-free TRQ on a reciprocal basis in some areas, if that were an alternative approach. So our starting point is 0-0. But obviously, rather than have no FTA at all, if the European Union aren't willing to go to 0-0 in the absence of a level playing field requirement, but would be, open to some mutually beneficial exchanges in some goods, then obviously we should have that conversation.
Is this something we're proposing to them? And if so, what kind of response are we getting on it?
Well, I hope you'll understand, because the negotiation is very much live, and as you pointed out, Michel Barnier is here at the moment for the second round, and David Frost's team were in Brussels last week. I don't want to describe anything that he might, conversations he might be having in those in those negotiations, because it's a matter for him to consider those. But generally speaking, as I said, we think 0-0 on all goods is the right approach. But if the EU won't do that, then of course, there would be an openness to discuss an FTA, because an FTA that delivers, some agreements is better than nothing at all, in our view. I don't know whether Mark wants to add anything.
Just spot on there, Secretary of State. As you said, we're going for a precedented agreement, and there are lots of agreements like Canada, like Korea, Japan, the EU have signed, where they've got very close to 0-0 without any of these quite stringent level playing field commitments that the EU are looking for from us. So we don't think that we need to agree to those. The Secretary of State said effectively being bound by EU law, and if moving away from 0-0 is what they've required from Canada, Korea, etc., then that would be in line with precedent. But at the moment, both sides have set out in the political declaration that they are aiming for 0-0.
But following what Lord Teverson said, with both sides' commitment actually to very strong climate and environmental goals, haven't we got other things we can propose to them to move this forward, rather than moving potentially to having to have some tariffs? It does seem sort of deeply frustrating to see this from the outside.
Yes, I think the suggestion, or the area on tariffs would be if the EU basically were unable to or unwilling to grant tariff-free access on certain goods without, alignment, for instance, on SPS measures or other technical product standard measures. I think when it comes to big issues like climate change, it's actually a very different matter in that we've got other international agreements and obligations. We've got our own, commitments, internationally. We're hosting COP26 next year. We've got those sort of nationally determined contributions to carbon reductions, and those international agreements are really what drives our approach to reducing carbon emissions, not something that the EU does, as it were. So I think we're all basically working towards the same goals through other international fora, and that shouldn't be dependent on, the FTA with the European Union, which is much more around product standards.
Thank you.
I think, the Secretary of State, one of the issues, isn't it, is that in the political declaration signed by the present government, that the level playing field is quite high profile within that political agreement, and I guess isn't that something that's maybe a difficulty on the negotiations when it comes to environmental level playing field?
Well, I think, and again, Mark may come in on specifics of this, but I think the different people have a different interpretation of what level playing field means. So, our view is that a level playing field requirements are quite common in FTAs, and they cover broad, they're kind of broad overarching, commitments, not to sort of, for non-regression and so forth, similar to what Canada and the EU agreed. The difficulty to date is that the European Union has seen level playing field as meaning that, we would have to abide by certain EU regulations and, subject ourselves to the European Court of Justice. And I think that's where the difference lies. It's on what people interpret a level playing field requirement to be.
Okay, so I'll ask the questioner on this particular area is Lord Young.
Thank you, Lord Chairman, and Secretary of State. It was fascinating to hear your contributions today. I suspect that you've already covered the territory that I wish to sort of further explore with regard to manufacturing industries for whom securing access to the EU market may be more important than resisting the EU's level playing field provisions. And so I note that you seem very confident that a free trade agreement, first of all, is better than no deal, and that you ought to be able to, you don't seem too worried about tariffs. You're fairly confident about zero tariff approach. So, are you in the mood for, it doesn't seem to me that you're in the mood for anything that relates specifically to the EU's level playing field for the reasons that you've previously stated?
Yes, that's right. And I think on the food manufacturing side, obviously, I think if you were to look at meat processors, for instance, particularly those processing lamb and exporting that to the European Union, there would be significant tariffs on lamb in the absence of an agreement. So that's probably our number one, I guess, concern in the absence of an agreement. And I think after that, there would be potentially some issues around barley. But for most of our food manufacturers, I think it's generally varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. But if you were to look at companies like ABF or Premier Foods, two big conglomerates, a lot of the brands that they have are based in a domestic market, and so they're very much a British brand. And although they're global companies, they will have subsidiaries in other countries operating as part of the group. You then have other companies, for instance, say Unilever, who in the last 20 years have been very much operating on a pan-European model, and they've delivered and developed pan-European brands with a lot more cross-border trade rather than national brands within national markets. So different businesses would have a different perspective, I suspect, on the importance or otherwise of having having an FTA agreement.
Yeah. Just a quick supplementary. Is there anything you feel as a result of current negotiations that you could do in relation to perhaps assuaging their concerns in the Environment Bill, the EU concerns, that is?
I don't think so. The Environment Bill, I hope, should already give them a lot of reassurance that the UK takes its environmental responsibilities seriously. Obviously, the last Labour government published introduced the Climate Change Act that set course for a decade of carbon reductions in this country. This current government is bringing forward a new environment bill that again sets out a whole framework of targets for environmental improvement. I hope from that the EU will take reassurance that we're serious about improving our environment.
Thank you, Secretary of State.
Okay, can I just, before we wrap up, can I just check whether Emma or Mark would like to come in with anything else? And thank you for your contribution so far. You're happy?
Not particularly in addition to the points the Secretary of State has raised, but thank you.
Thank you. Mark, was there anything else you wanted to bring in?
No, nothing for me, thank you.
Good, okay. Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed for coming in front of us. I think we found that very useful. I think our main messages you're quite clear about, which is one on Northern Ireland. There is a lot to fix there, and it is the detail that's actually needed. So we understand that it's not completely in your control of that side because of Northern Ireland Secretary of State and the negotiations that are going on. The fisheries side, we can't let the fisheries industry stop the whole sensible deal between the EU and the UK. We understand the difficulties there, but I'm sure from having spoken with Michel Barnier at the EU committee level, there's a landing zone somewhere there. And as we've just said, on the level playing field side, then when the two blocks, if you like, have the same aspirations, there has to be a way forward. So we wish you every success in your negotiations. We very much hope that there will be an agreement. And I don't know whether there's anything you just, Secretary of State, you wanted just to give us a final message before we finish.
No, I think the only thing I would say is obviously the negotiations that are ongoing now are, a crucial final phase, if you like. And, it's very important to see what progress we can make, I think, by the end of this month. And, hopefully progress will be made. I think we also understand, though, that there would come a point when business would need to know what it was preparing for. And so you wouldn't want negotiations just to drag on and business still get to the late autumn and not know what environment they'd be planning for in January. So it's quite an important phase, really, and we need to try to bring these negotiations to a satisfactory conclusion.
I think we would absolutely agree with you that. I guess, sorry, the other thing I should have added on is the whole REACH and the chemicals industry there. I mean, the chemicals industry is our second largest industry in the UK, and I think there is still a lot to be sorted out there. Secretary of State, Emma Bourne, Mark Thompson, thank you very much indeed for being our witnesses, and I bring this formal public session to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks.